Highway 86 was a stretch of road whispered about in hushed tones in truck stops and diners along its route. Locals swore it was cursed, but the reasons behind their unease were as foggy as the endless nights that blanketed the asphalt. Travelers who dared take the highway often shared chilling accounts of strange happenings: phantom headlights, disembodied screams, and shadows darting across the road. Most dismissed the tales as urban legends, but others knew better. For Dean and Kara, it was just another road. They were driving through the desert, their car packed with camping gear, snacks, and the fatigue of a long journey. The plan was to cut hours off their trip by taking Highway 86 instead of the safer, well-lit interstate. Dean was skeptical of the highway's dark reputation, but Kara was uneasy. "It's just a road," Dean said, grinning as he turned onto the infamous stretch. The first few miles were unremarkable. The moon hung high, casting an eerie glow over the barren landscape. But as they drove deeper into the night, the atmosphere shifted. The air seemed heavier, the silence oppressive. Kara noticed it first, a static-like hum, faint but persistent. It wasn't coming from the radio or the engine. It was just there, hanging in the air. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice tight. Dean listened, but shrugged. "Probably power lines or something." "There are no power lines out here," Kara replied, glancing nervously out the window. The endless desert seemed to stretch unnaturally, the horizon blurring as if the landscape itself were shifting. Then came the headlights. At first, they appeared far in the distance, a pair of dim, flickering orbs. Dean squinted and adjusted the rearview mirror. "Looks like someone's behind us," he muttered. But the lights didn't grow brighter or closer. They stayed fixed, like two eyes watching them. Kara's anxiety deepened. "Maybe we should stop and let them pass," she suggested. Dean hesitated but nodded. He pulled over, the tires crunching against loose gravel. They waited, but the headlights didn't move. After a minute, they simply blinked out. The road behind them was pitch black. "That's weird," Dean admitted, starting the car again. Kara said nothing, her fingers digging into the armrest. The hum grew louder as they continued, morphing into something rhythmic like a heartbeat. Kara could feel it vibrating in her chest, matching the pulse of her fear. She kept her eyes on the road ahead, but out of the corner of her eye she saw movement. A shadow darting through the desert, keeping pace with the car. "Dean," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Something's out there." He didn't respond, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. He'd seen it too. The figure was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs too long, its movements too jerky. It didn't run so much as glide, its dark form blending seamlessly with the night. "Floor it," Kara urged. Dean didn't need convincing. He pressed the accelerator, the engine roaring as the car sped down the highway. The shadow followed, its unnatural gait unrelenting. The hum was deafening now, a suffocating roar that seemed to emanate from the road itself. Kara clutched her ears, screaming for it to stop, but the noise only grew louder. Suddenly, the headlights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Dean cursed, slamming on the brakes. The car skidded to a halt, the tires screeching against the asphalt. Silence enveloped them, oppressive and absolute. "Dean," Kara whispered, her voice barely audible. "Do you see that?" Ahead of them, faintly illuminated by the moonlight, was a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was tall, its limbs impossibly thin, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. It didn't move, didn't breathe. Its face was obscured, but they could feel its gaze piercing through the windshield. Dean fumbled for the ignition, his hands shaking. The engine sputtered but refused to start. The figure took a step forward, then another, its movements deliberate and menacing. Kara screamed as the shadowy entity reached the car, its bony fingers scraping against the window. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard, sending chills down their spines. "Go away!" Kara shouted, but the figure didn't stop. It pressed its face against the glass, and for a brief moment they saw it. A grotesque, eyeless visage with a gaping mouth that stretched impossibly wide. A guttural, inhuman sound erupted from it, shaking the car. Dean finally got the engine to roar to life. Without thinking, he slammed the car into reverse, the tires spinning wildly as they sped backward down the highway. The figure didn't follow this time. It simply stood there, watching, its head slowly turning to track their retreat. When they finally reached the end of Highway 86, the oppressive hum vanished. The air felt lighter, the world normal again. Dean and Kara didn't speak as they merged onto the interstate, their minds racing to process what had just happened. They never told anyone about that night. But every now and then, when driving late at night, Kara would hear a faint hum, distant but unmistakable, and she knew. Highway 86 hadn't forgotten them. The sign loomed out of the darkness. Next rest stop, 2 miles. It was a welcome sight for Julie, who had been driving for hours on a lonely stretch of interstate surrounded by dense forest. Her eyes burned from fatigue, her fingers cramped from gripping the steering wheel. She had ignored her GPS's warnings about staying on major routes, thinking a shortcut through the back roads would shave hours off her trip. Now, with her gas gauge dipping toward empty and her bladder uncomfortably full, the glowing sign felt like salvation. The rest stop appeared suddenly, tucked between towering pines. It was a small building, dimly lit by a flickering overhead bulb. A single car sat in the lot, its windows fogged up. Julie pulled in and parked a few spaces away, her headlights slicing through the eerie silence. She stepped out, shivering as the cold air bit through her jacket. The forest around her was deathly quiet, the kind of silence that made her ears ring. Julie glanced at the other car, expecting to see movement, but it sat lifeless, its engine off. The restroom door creaked as she pushed it open. Inside, the flickering fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long, jittery shadows. It smelled of bleach and damp concrete. The mirrors were cracked, reflecting warped, ghostly versions of herself. Julie hurried into a stall and locked the door. As she relieved herself, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The faintest whisper reached her ears like a breeze slipping through a crack. She froze, holding her breath. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing. Silence. Shaking it off, she flushed and stepped out. The restroom was empty, but something was different. The door she'd entered through was now slightly ajar, though she distinctly remembered it closing behind her. Julie washed her hands quickly, avoiding her reflection in the broken mirror. She hated how the fractured glass made her face look wrong, stretched, distorted, unfamiliar. As she turned to leave, she noticed wet footprints on the floor. They weren't hers. They led from the far stall to the sink and stopped abruptly. Her pulse quickened as she hurried out of the building, the heavy door slamming shut behind her. The parking lot was even darker now, the flickering bulb casting feeble light. The other car was still there, but something about it seemed off. The windows were still fogged, but the condensation had started to drip down in long, irregular streaks, as if someone inside had pressed their hands or face against the glass. Julie climbed into her car, locking the doors. Her hands trembled as she started the engine, but it sputtered and died. "Not now," she muttered, turning the key again. Nothing. The engine was dead. She grabbed her phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Panic bubbled in her chest as she glanced back at the other car. The fogged windows were now clear. She could see inside, but it was empty. A loud knock on her window made her scream. She whipped around, expecting to see someone there, but the lot was empty. Her breath fogged the glass as she scanned the darkness, her heart pounding in her ears. Another knock, this time on the passenger side. She turned and saw it, an outline of a figure standing just beyond the reach of the flickering light. It was impossibly tall, its limbs unnaturally long, its head cocked at an angle that made her stomach churn. The figure moved closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face was obscured, but she could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting. It pressed its hand against the passenger window, leaving a wet, streaky print. Julie scrambled to the driver's side door, fumbling with the lock. She threw it open and bolted into the night, her only thought to get away. Her legs pumped wildly as she ran toward the highway, the forest closing in around her. The sound of footsteps followed her, wet and heavy, slapping against the pavement. They weren't human footsteps. They were uneven, distorted, as if the figure were dragging something behind it. Julie didn't dare look back. Her lungs burned, her legs screamed for her to stop, but she kept running until the highway came into view. She stumbled onto the shoulder, waving her arms desperately as a pair of headlights approached. The truck screeched to a halt and the driver jumped out. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Julie collapsed, gasping for air. Someone's after me." The driver helped her to her feet, looking back toward the rest stop. "There's nobody there," he said, his voice tinged with confusion. Julie turned and saw the rest stop in the distance. The lot was empty. Her car was gone. The driver insisted on taking her to the nearest town. Julie sat silently in the passenger seat, her hands trembling. She glanced in the side mirror, and her heart stopped. In the faint reflection, she saw the figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching them drive away. Its head was still cocked, its face still hidden, and this time it raised a hand to wave. The storm rolled in without warning, drenching the winding mountain roads in sheets of relentless rain. Jake squinted through the windshield, his wipers fighting a losing battle against the downpour. He was miles from the nearest town. His phone had no signal, and the gas gauge was perilously close to empty. As he navigated the treacherous curves, a burst of static erupted from the car's old radio. Jake jumped, startled. He hadn't turned it on. Before he could fiddle with the knobs, a voice cut through the crackling. "Welcome to 106, the last broadcast." Jake frowned. He hadn't touched the dial, and the station wasn't familiar. The voice was low and smooth, but there was something unsettling about it, like a whisper too close to your ear. "Tonight," the voice continued, "we bring you a special feature. A tale of a lone traveler on a dark and stormy night. Sound familiar?" Jake's breath hitched. He glanced at the radio, then back at the road. "Creepy coincidence," he muttered to himself. The host chuckled as if he'd heard. "Oh, Jake, it's no coincidence." The car swerved as Jake's hands jerked on the wheel. His name. The radio had said his name. "Who is this?" he demanded, his voice shaking. But the voice didn't respond directly. Instead, it continued the broadcast, the tone colder now. "Our traveler thought he was alone, but the storm hides many secrets. Some roads should never be taken." Jake's heart raced. He reached for the radio's power button, but it wouldn't turn off. He tried changing the station, but the knob spun uselessly. The voice grew louder. "He doesn't realize what's following him. Not yet." Jake's eyes darted to the rearview mirror. The road behind him was empty, but his gut told him otherwise. He pressed the accelerator, the car groaning as it climbed a steep incline. The host's voice shifted, the smoothness giving way to something distorted, almost guttural. "But he'll see it soon. Oh yes, he'll see it, and so will you, dear listener." A shadow moved in the corner of Jake's vision. He turned his head sharply, but there was nothing outside the rain-streaked windows. The headlights illuminated only the narrow stretch of road ahead, lined with skeletal trees. Then he heard it, a faint scraping sound, like claws dragging against metal. It seemed to come from the roof of the car. "Stop the car, Jake," the voice urged, now dripping with malice. "Let it in. Leave me alone," Jake shouted, gripping the wheel tighter. The scraping grew louder, more insistent. Suddenly, the headlights flickered, and for a split second, the world was plunged into darkness. When they came back on, something was standing in the middle of the road. Jake slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the slick asphalt. The car came to a jarring stop mere feet from the figure. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and its face, if it could be called a face, was a shifting void, like a hole torn into reality. The radio crackled with laughter, a horrifying, guttural sound. "He's here, Jake. He's been waiting for you." The figure moved closer, its limbs jerking unnaturally as though it were a puppet on invisible strings. Jake threw the car into reverse, but the engine sputtered and died. The voice on the radio grew louder, drowning out Jake's panicked breaths. "Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Let's see how the story ends." The figure reached the hood of the car, its void-like face inches from the windshield. The glass began to frost over, cracks spiderwebbing outward as if it were being frozen from the inside. Jake scrambled for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The last thing he heard was the sound of shattering glass, the cold laughter of the radio host echoing in his ears. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the road eerily quiet. A local sheriff found Jake's car abandoned on the roadside, the driver's seat empty. The radio played softly, a static-filled whisper. "Thanks for tuning in to the last broadcast." It was past midnight when Lisa found herself on a desolate road, her GPS stubbornly rerouting her after a highway closure. The path led her through the mountains, twisting and turning in ways that made her uneasy. But the worst part was the tunnel. It appeared suddenly as she rounded a sharp bend, a gaping black maw carved into the mountainside. Her headlights illuminated a faded sign above the entrance. Clearwater Tunnel, 3 miles. The letters were chipped, and the paint was streaked as though something had clawed at it. Lisa hesitated. The tunnel stretched ahead, swallowing the light. Her GPS insisted this was the only route, and turning back wasn't an option. Sighing, she tightened her grip on the wheel and drove in. The walls of the tunnel were damp and narrow, the rough stones seeming to close in on her. Her radio fizzled into static as soon as she entered. Lisa tried to shake off the growing tension in her chest, blaming it on fatigue. The sound came first, a faint tapping that echoed around her. It was steady, rhythmic, like something hitting the ground behind her car. Lisa glanced in the rearview mirror, but the tunnel was dark, the end she'd entered no longer visible. The tapping grew louder, now mixed with a scraping sound, as though nails were dragging across the tunnel walls. Her pulse quickened. "Just keep going," she muttered to herself, her foot pressing harder on the accelerator. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something. A figure. It was pressed against the wall of the tunnel, its body twisted unnaturally. Its face, or what passed for a face, was turned toward her, the skin pale and waxy, with empty sockets where eyes should have been. Lisa screamed, jerking the wheel. Her tires squealed as the car grazed the tunnel wall, sparks flying. The figure didn't move, but its head twisted unnaturally to follow her. The tapping stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse than the sound. Then came a thud, soft at first, but rapidly growing louder, as if something heavy were sprinting toward her. Lisa's hands shook as she floored the gas pedal. The engine roared, and the car surged forward. Her heart pounded, the tunnel seemingly stretching on forever. The sound was almost on top of her now. She dared another glance in the rearview mirror and regretted it immediately. Something was chasing her. It wasn't running. It was crawling, its limbs bending and snapping grotesquely as it moved. Its mouth hung open, a black void that seemed to suck in the faint light. Ahead, a faint pinprick of light appeared, the tunnel's exit. Relief flooded Lisa's chest. She kept her eyes locked on it, praying she'd make it out before whatever was behind her caught up. The car jerked suddenly, as though something had grabbed it. Lisa screamed. The steering wheel wrenched from her hands. The headlights flickered, and for a horrifying moment she thought the engine would die. "Come on! Come on!" she shouted, slamming her fist against the dashboard. The car surged forward again, breaking free from whatever had grabbed it. The light at the end of the tunnel grew brighter, and Lisa felt a surge of hope. She didn't dare look back. When she burst out of the tunnel, the night air felt like a lifeline. She sped down the road, not stopping until she reached a brightly lit gas station miles away. Shaking, Lisa pulled into the lot and stumbled out of the car. The attendant gave her a concerned look, but she waved him off, needing a moment to collect herself. That's when she saw it. On the back of her car, gouged deep into the metal, were 4 long scratches, as though something with claws had tried to hold on. Lisa didn't speak of the tunnel to anyone, but from that night forward, she avoided mountain roads. She wasn't sure what she'd seen or if she'd imagined it, but sometimes, late at night, she'd hear tapping outside her bedroom window, and she'd know it was still out there, waiting. The rain was relentless, hammering against the windshield as Mark drove along the empty highway. He had been on the road for hours, exhausted, and the storm made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The glow of a neon sign cutting through the darkness felt like a godsend. Vacancy. Mark turned into the gravel lot, his tires splashing through deep puddles. The building was small and decrepit, with peeling paint and a single flickering light above the office door. It didn't look like much, but he was too tired to care. The bell above the office door jingled as he entered. The air inside was damp and carried the faint scent of mildew. Behind the counter stood an elderly man with hollow eyes and a thin smile that didn't quite reach them. "Room for the night?" the man asked, his voice raspy. "Yeah," Mark replied, handing over a crumpled bill. The old man slid a rusted key across the counter. "Room 6. End of the hall. Keep quiet, though. The other guests don't like noise." Mark frowned, but didn't question it. He grabbed the key and trudged back out into the rain, finding his room at the far end of the long, narrow building. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a small, dingy space with a single bed, a flickering lamp, and a cracked mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. Too tired to think, Mark collapsed onto the bed. The springs groaned beneath his weight, and the stale sheets smelled faintly of mold, but he didn't care. He closed his eyes, letting exhaustion take over. Somewhere in the haze of half-sleep, he heard it. Footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud against the silence. Mark sat up, his heart pounding. He glanced at the door, which was locked, and told himself it was just another guest. But the footsteps stopped right outside his room. He held his breath, straining to hear. There was a long pause, then a soft scraping sound, like nails dragging down the wooden door. Mark's stomach twisted. "Hello?" he called. his voice shaky. No response. The scraping stopped, but the oppressive silence that followed was worse. He tried to shake it off, blaming it on his tired mind. Lying back down, he turned off the lamp and pulled the thin blanket over himself. Minutes passed, and just as he began to drift off, there was a knock on the window. Mark froze. His room was on the second floor. Slowly, he turned his head toward the window. The rain streaked down the glass, distorting the outside world, but he could make out a silhouette. A face was pressed against the pane, pale and gaunt, its mouth stretched into a too-wide grin. The figure's hand lifted, its long fingers tapping rhythmically against the glass. Mark leapt from the bed and backed into the corner of the room, his chest heaving. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure tilted its head as though studying him, then dissolved into the shadows as though it had never been there. Mark didn't sleep that night. When dawn finally broke, he gathered his things and bolted to the office to check out. The bell above the door jingled, but the desk was empty. The old man was gone. Frustrated, Mark tossed the room key on the counter and turned to leave, but something caught his eye. A dusty guest book sat open on the counter, its yellowed pages filled with scribbled names. He flipped through it absent-mindedly, his hand freezing when he reached the last page. His name was written there, followed by the date and the word checkout scrawled beneath it in shaky handwriting. The date was 5 years ago. Mark stumbled back, his mind racing. He ran out of the office, only to stop dead in his tracks. The parking lot was empty, his car was gone. The motel itself was in ruins, overgrown with weeds, its neon sign shattered and rusted. And from one of the broken windows of room 6, he swore he saw a pale face watching him, its too-wide grin lingering long after he ran down the road. It was the kind of night where the darkness felt alive, pressing in from all sides. Matt had been driving for hours along a desolate stretch of highway, the only light coming from his headlights and the occasional flash of distant lightning. He was running on fumes, both his car's tank and his own energy. Up ahead, a figure appeared on the side of the road, standing just outside the reach of his headlights. It was a man with his thumb out, soaked to the bone from the rain. Matt hesitated. Picking up hitchhikers wasn't something he normally did, but the storm was merciless, and the thought of leaving someone stranded felt cruel. Against his better judgment, he slowed down and rolled down the passenger window. "Need a ride?" The man leaned down, his face shadowed by the hood of his jacket. "Thanks," he said, his voice low and rough. Matt unlocked the door, and the man climbed in without another word, water dripping onto the car's floor mat. He carried no bag, no belongings, just himself. "You heading somewhere specific?" Matt asked, trying to break the tension. The man didn't answer right away. He sat unnervingly still, staring straight ahead. "Anywhere is fine," he finally said. Matt nodded, though the response unsettled him. He pressed on, the silence in the car growing heavy. As the miles passed, Matt stole glances at the hitchhiker. Something was off. The man's clothes were oddly clean despite the rain, and his hands, resting on his knees, looked pale and waxy, like they didn't belong to a living person. "You've been out here long?" Matt asked, his voice cracking slightly. The hitchhiker turned to him slowly. "Long enough," he said with a faint smile. That smile sent a chill down Matt's spine. He tried to focus on the road, but the air in the car seemed colder now. The radio, which had been playing faintly in the background, crackled with static and then went silent. "Mind if I ask why you're out here?" Matt ventured again, his unease growing. The hitchhiker chuckled, low and guttural. "You picked me up? Isn't that enough?" Matt gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. The rain pounded harder, the wipers barely keeping up. He glanced at the man again and froze. The hitchhiker was staring at him now, his hood down, revealing a face that was wrong. His eyes were milky white, his skin stretched tightly over his skull, and his mouth was too wide, filled with teeth that seemed too sharp. Matt slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. "Get out," he shouted, his voice trembling. The hitchhiker didn't move. He simply tilted his head, his grin growing wider. "You invited me in," he said softly. Panicking, Matt threw open his door and scrambled out into the rain. He turned back toward the car, expecting the man to follow, but the passenger seat was empty. The door was still locked. Matt stood there in the downpour, his heart hammering, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He climbed back into the car, locking the doors and gripping the wheel like it was a lifeline. He drove. faster now, desperate to put distance between himself and whatever had just occurred. But the storm only seemed to grow worse, the road stretching endlessly before him, and then he saw it. Up ahead, on the side of the road, stood the hitchhiker, his thumb out once more. Matt's blood ran cold. He sped past, not daring to slow down, but when he glanced in his rearview mirror, the man wasn't on the roadside anymore. He was in the back seat. "Thanks for the ride," the hitchhiker whispered. The car veered off the road, and everything went black. When Matt's car was found the next morning, it was overturned in a ditch. The driver's seat was empty, the doors locked from the inside. Locals tell stories of the midnight hitchhiker, a restless spirit who haunts that stretch of road, searching for drivers foolish enough to let him in. Some say he just takes a ride. Others say he takes much more. Every small town has its legends, and Briarwood was no different. Locals avoided the woods past the old mill, especially after dark. They whispered about the whistling, a soft, eerie tune that floated through the trees, luring anyone who heard it deeper into the forest. Those who followed never came back. Of course, teenagers, being teenagers, loved to test their courage. Claire, David, and Mia were no exception. "It's just a dumb story." David scoffed as they stood at the edge of the woods, flashlights in hand. "Yeah," Claire added, trying to sound brave, though her voice wavered. "Probably just the wind." Mia didn't say anything. She wasn't so sure. She'd heard the stories growing up, how the whistling wasn't random, how it sounded like a lullaby when it was close and a funeral dirge when it was far. "Let's go," David said, leading the way into the forest. The woods were unnaturally quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath their boots. The deeper they went, the thicker the trees became, their gnarled branches twisting like claws overhead. And then they heard it. A faint whistle. It started low and slow, a melody that seemed to hang in the air. It wasn't random, and it wasn't the wind. "Do you hear that?" Claire whispered, her flashlight beam shaking. "Yeah," David said, though his confidence had faltered. "It's just someone messing with us." Mia grabbed Claire's arm. "We should go back." But David ignored them, moving further into the woods. The whistle grew louder, the tune shifting as if it were beckoning them. "David, stop," Mia called. But he didn't listen. The whistling stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, from somewhere behind them, the whistle started again. Closer, sharper, more insistent. "Who's there?" David yelled, spinning around with his flashlight. The beam illuminated nothing but trees. "David," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. "It's not a person." The whistle moved again, this time to their left, then to their right, then directly in front of them, though nothing was there. "We need to go," Claire said, her voice breaking. They turned to run, but the path they had come from was gone. In its place were more trees, their trunks impossibly close together. The whistling grew louder, the tune speeding up. It was all around them now, circling, closing in. Mia screamed as something darted past her, a shadow too fast to see clearly, but its presence sent a wave of icy fear through her body. "Keep moving," David shouted. They stumbled through the forest, the whistling chasing them, growing louder and more frantic. The melody seemed to twist into a mocking laughter, echoing in their ears. Claire tripped and fell, her flashlight rolling away. When she scrambled to her feet, the others were gone. "David? Mia?" she called, her voice cracking. The whistling stopped. The silence was worse. Claire spun in circles, her flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. "Guys, this isn't funny." A low hum began, vibrating in the air around her. She turned toward the sound and froze. A figure stood in the shadows, tall and thin, its face obscured by a dark hood. In one skeletal hand it held a wooden flute. The figure raised the flute to where its mouth should have been and began to play. The tune was slow and haunting, and Claire felt her body move against her will. Her legs carried her forward, closer to the figure, though her mind screamed for her to stop. "No, please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was the figure lowering its hood to reveal a face that wasn't human, a hollow skull with empty sockets that seemed to see everything. When the sun rose, the townspeople found David and Mia stumbling out of the woods, pale and disoriented. They never spoke of what happened, but they couldn't escape the sound. At night, they both still hear the whistle, soft and distant, calling them back to the woods. Sarah lived in a small, quiet town where nothing much ever happened. Her house sat on the edge of the woods, far enough from the town center that the nights were eerily silent. It was the kind of place where the creak of a floorboard or the rustle of leaves could make your imagination run wild. One autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah settled into her couch with a book. The faint glow of her reading lamp bathed the room in warm light, and the cool wind outside rattled the windows. It was peaceful, until she looked up. For a moment, she thought she saw something in the window, a pale face staring back at her. But when she blinked, it was gone. Her heart skipped a beat. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination or a trick of the light. After all, her house was surrounded by trees. Maybe it was just the reflection of the branches moving in the breeze. Still, she got up and double-checked the lock on the door and all the windows. Satisfied, she returned to her book. The first knock came an hour later. It was soft but deliberate, a slow, steady tap on the front door. Sarah froze, her fingers gripping the book tightly. "Who is it?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. She crept to the peephole and peered out. The porch was empty. She waited, her breath shallow, but the knock didn't come again. Shaking her head, she told herself it was just kids playing a prank. She sat back down, trying to ignore the unease creeping up her spine. Then she heard it again. This time, the knock came from the window, 3 slow taps. Sarah whipped around, staring at the glass. Nothing, just her reflection and the dark shapes of the trees outside. She grabbed her phone, dialing her best friend, Emily. "Someone's messing with me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you sure?" Emily asked. "You live out in the middle of nowhere. Who'd be out there?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, her eyes darting to the window. Emily sighed. "It's probably nothing. Lock your doors, turn on all the lights, and call me if it happens again." Sarah did as Emily suggested, flipping on every light in the house. But as the hours ticked by, the unease refused to leave her. She tried to distract herself with TV, but every little sound made her jump. Around midnight, she decided to go to bed. She checked all the locks one last time before heading upstairs. The feeling of being watched was stronger in her room. Her window faced the woods, and despite the curtains being closed, she couldn't shake the sensation that something was out there. She tried to ignore it, climbing under the covers and closing her eyes. The tapping started again. This time, it was louder, insistent, coming from her bedroom window. Sarah's stomach twisted. She stayed frozen in bed, her heart hammering, the sound growing more frantic with each passing second. "Go away," she finally screamed, her voice cracking. The tapping stopped. The silence was unbearable. Slowly, she forced herself out of bed and approached the window. Her hands trembled as she reached for the curtain. Taking a deep breath, she yanked it open. The face was inches away, pressed against the glass. It wasn't human. Its eyes were too large, its skin gray and stretched tight over its skull. Its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing jagged teeth. Sarah stumbled backwards, screaming. The face didn't move, but its eyes followed her, unblinking. She grabbed her phone, but her hands shook so badly that it slipped from her grasp. When she looked up again, the face was gone. The next morning, Sarah's friend Emily came over after hearing about the ordeal. Together, they inspected the house. Outside the bedroom window, they found footprints in the dirt. They were deep and clawed, leading away from the house and disappearing into the woods. Emily tried to reassure her that it was probably just an animal, but Sarah knew better. That night, as she sat in her locked house, every light blazing, she heard it again. 3 slow taps on the window. The face was back, and this time it was smiling wider. Megan had just moved into her new apartment, a small but cozy 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor of an old building downtown. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The place had a certain charm: creaky floors, large windows that let in the moonlight, and a quiet stillness at night that she found comforting. The first few days were uneventful. She spent her time unpacking, arranging furniture, and settling into her new life. But on the 4th night, things started to change. It was subtle at first. She'd feel a shift in the air, like someone was watching her, though she was completely alone. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, stretching unnaturally in the dim light. She brushed it off as her imagination, until she saw him. It was late, and Megan was lying on her couch, scrolling through her phone. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a shadow in the corner of the room, near the ceiling. She looked up, expecting to see a trick of the light, but her heart stopped. A man stood there, pressed into the corner where the walls met the ceiling, his limbs impossibly long and twisted, his head tilted unnaturally, his face obscured in darkness. Megan screamed, scrambling off the couch and backing toward the door. She fumbled for the light switch, flooding the room with brightness. The corner was empty. She stood there, trembling, her eyes darting around the room. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, just out of sight. After a sleepless night, Megan convinced herself it had been a hallucination. Moving was stressful, and she was tired. That was all. But the next night, it happened again. This time, she saw him in her bedroom. As she lay in bed, trying to fall asleep, her eyes wandered to the far corner of the room. There he was, crouched like a spider, his body pressed tightly against the walls. Megan froze, too terrified to move. The man didn't come closer. He simply stayed there, watching. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying he would disappear. When she opened them, the corner was empty again. Megan started keeping every light on, even at night. She avoided the corners of her apartment, refusing to look at them for fear of seeing him again. But the more she tried to ignore him, the worse it got. The man began appearing more frequently, always in the corners, always watching. Sometimes she'd catch him out of the corner of her eye while brushing her teeth or making coffee. Other times she'd feel his presence as she lay in bed, paralyzed with fear. He never moved, never spoke, but his presence was suffocating. One night, Megan decided she couldn't take it anymore. She packed a bag, determined to leave the apartment for good, but as she reached for the doorknob, she felt a chill behind her. Slowly, she turned around. The man was there, standing in the corner closest to her, his face inches from hers. For the first time, she could see his features, sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, and a wide, unnatural smile that stretched across his face. "Stay," he whispered, his voice raspy and cold. Megan screamed and bolted out the door, leaving everything behind. She didn't stop running until she reached the street. She moved in with a friend that night, refusing to return to the apartment. Weeks later, she sent movers to collect her things. When they arrived, they called her, confused. The apartment was empty, completely bare, as though no one had ever lived there. But when Megan looked through the photos they sent, her blood ran cold. In the corner of one picture, near the ceiling, she could see the faint outline of a man, smiling wide,